and I'm scaling up nutrition, youth leader for nutrition, based in Zimbabwe, working closely with the civil society here in Zimbabwe, that is headed by the Zimbabwe Scaling Up Nutrition Civil Society Alliance, ZIXOSUNA. And I'll be your moderator today for this lovely event that we have going on, is we're going to discuss and talk about upholding the right to food. And also, I'm a law student, a final year law student at the University of Zimbabwe. And our guest speaker today is SUN lead group member, Mr. Pierre Cooke Jr. And he also happens to be a lawyer, and he's a health and human rights advocate in the Barbados and the Caribbean at large. He graduated the Bachelor's of Laws at in West Indies University, Cave Hill College, and currently is at the Upholding Law School, pursuing his certification to practice law in the Caribbean and the Commonwealth countries. And also, just as a reminder, we do have interpretation options available. We have English, French, and Spanish. So if you just go on the three dots by the corner on the settings, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to get any interpretation for any of those three languages. So talking about a guest speaker, the work that he has done is quite tremendous. He's been working largely in the nutrition space and advocating for children's rights and prevention of childhood obesity, prevention of like non-communicable diseases in young people, and has worked with a number of huge organizations such as the World Health Organizations, the Healthy Caribbean Coalition, the Pan-American Health Organization. And Mr. Cooke has been invited to speak at large across like a number of countries in the world. And he has been using his voice and the platform that he has just to raise awareness about, nutrition amongst young people, and for those institutions and government to adopt meaningful youth engagements in the work that they do. So he'll be our guest speaker for today, as we'd be tackling and focusing on the issue of upholding the right to food. Like, how best can we utilize the law and legal frameworks to make sure that everyone has access to adequate food, and no one is left behind when it comes to the issue of health, nutrition, and diet. Maybe some of the few things that I've picked up myself is that the right to food is a human right, and it's articulated in Article 11 of the Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations. And I believe in most countries across the world, the right to food is well articulated in most constitutions. Like, for example, in my country, Zimbabwe, it's articulated in Section 15 and Section 77B of our constitution speaks to the right to food. Yes. So today we're going to be talking about how best then can you use those legal provisions that are in our constitution, that are in our international law, to make sure that no one is left behind, and anyone is and everyone has the right to adequate food, and making sure that that right to adequate food is. So this time I'll hand it over to our guest speaker, Mr. Pierre Cooke Jr. If you can start with your presentation, Mason.
Hi, thank you, Webster. Just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you correctly.
Brilliant. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. Are you able to see that? Yes.
Yes, I can see that. Yes.
Perfect. So I want to say thank you to all of you for joining. This is a topic that is, very close to my heart. Human rights advocacy is something that I've taken up since starting my legal studies, and it's a particularly unique way to go about advocacy. Now, as you can see, the title of this presentation is looking at upholding access to nutrition in challenging times, and you'll understand, I hope, at the end of the presentation, why human rights are useful especially in these challenging times that we're in. So we're looking at a rights-based approach. And interestingly, you'll see that I'm looking at the right to food and nutrition, because those two things are interrelated. So let's see, right. So I'll be going through human rights, why it is and how it is this great balancing tool for citizens and vulnerable communities. Who has the responsibility to protect human rights? What does human rights mean for food and nutrition advocacy? What are some examples of rights-based food and nutrition advocacy? And I'm going to give you examples from the Caribbean. Those would be my personal experiences. And then we'll go on to what you can do as civil society members, members of government, as individuals to promote human rights-based advocacy. Now, this photo you'll see shows equality and equity. And you see, equality is where everyone is just given the same platform. You put everyone on the same level and they have to battle it out to access things. Whereas equity tries to meet people where they're at, depending on their individual needs, to provide support for them. So human rights is a way for the legal system to ensure that everyone is protected. The value in human rights is that it ensures that the most vulnerable persons, those most vulnerable people in communities, have access to certain standards of living. When the Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights was introduced, it was just after the Second World War. And what the governments around the world decided was that they needed a basic standard for human living and something to ensure that we didn't have those wars again. So what countries came together and decided on is that these are the things that our citizens must have access to. You don't have to apply for human rights. You don't have to qualify for human rights. Just by being a human being, you are entitled to human rights. And that's the beauty of it. So in promoting fairness and equity, it ensures that persons from whatever backgrounds you're from, whether you identify as Christian, whatever your sexuality, whatever your gender, wherever you are in the world, human rights is the basic standard for a decent living. And so the most vulnerable in our communities are the ones that human rights most importantly protects. And another important thing to understand is that they're universal and interdependent. What does that mean? It means that if you're going to protect the right to food, you also have to protect the right to nutrition. And if you're going to protect the right to nutrition, you have to protect the right to a healthy environment. So they're all connected. So there's no upholding one and then neglecting the other. They're all intertwined, and we'll get into that a bit more. Now, the responsibility for protecting our human rights. Our governments, 197 countries, I believe, across the world have signed on to the Convention of Human Rights, different conventions. So there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's the Children's Rights Convention. And basically what happens is that when your governments sign on to these conventions, they create or accept a legal responsibility to ensure that you as citizens have access to them. So the persons with the primary responsibility to ensure you have access to your human rights are the governments. They have a responsibility to protect, promote, respect, and fulfill human rights. Now, it means that governments must then put laws in place and put policies in place to ensure that people across their country have access to these basic human rights. Now, Webster mentioned something that is particularly interesting. So in his constitution, there's the right to food. In some countries, their constitution doesn't have that right to food. In many Caribbean countries, we do not have the explicit right to food within our constitutions. But what the International Convention does is that once your government has signed on to it, whether it's within your constitution or not, you have access to these rights, and necessarily you can hold your governments accountable. You can say to them, you have a legal responsibility to protect this. And if you are not protecting this, I can necessarily say, well, we need to take some legal action, or we need to step forward in some decisive way. And if you look at the photo just in the corner, that photo is from some children, young persons in the US who took an action to court on the basis of their right to the environment. And that was looking at climate change. Now, over the last 2 to 3 years, 5 years almost, I've seen more and more persons taking governments to court, taking institutions to court for neglecting to ensure to protect, promote, and respect their right to the environment. And so that same train of thinking, our governments have a responsibility to ensure we have access to food, we have access to quality food, we have access to nutrition. So necessarily we can say in our advocacy, you have the responsibility. What it means then is that we're not begging our governments to do us a favor when we're asking for them to protect the right to food. We are reminding them that it is their responsibility to ensure that we have the right to food. Not only is there their responsibility, it is a legal responsibility. Yeah. So what does this system and framework of rights advocacy and rights-based advocacy mean for food and nutrition? How can we tie in that legal responsibility of government, the legal role of governments to protect human rights into our food and nutrition advocacy? Now, within human rights conventions, you may find that they disclose the right to adequate food. And different persons might have different interpretations of what adequate food may mean. Some people may think that means, you just need access to something to eat. Other persons may think it means you need access to quality foods. Some people may think it means that you need access to 5-star meals. But within the international conventions on human rights, they explicitly detail what this right means. And it's most comprehensively set out in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In my research, I found that this convention has a very explicit outline of what the right to food means. You can find them in other conventions. It's in the Convention on the Rights of a Child. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But if you want a concrete idea of what the right to food may mean, I would advise you to take a look at the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, the right to food doesn't just mean the right to access to food. It means that you have the right to be free from hunger. It means that you have the right to be free from malnutrition and undernutrition. Now, many times in this advocacy space, we can find that persons may promote the right to food and may not necessarily look at the importance of nutrition. So it's not only that you should have access to food, but that food should be of a certain quality. Now, governments shouldn't be giving or only providing access to foods that are high in salt, high in fats, high in sugars. Necessarily, the food should be nutritious. And so in looking at the interpretation of human rights, we're not taking this narrow approach. So we're not just saying, I have the right to food, so the government needs to ensure that I have food. No, it's beyond that. You have the right to nutritious food. You have the right to not be suffering in hunger. You have the right to not be suffering in undernutrition and malnutrition. And I think within this space, we understand the difference between malnutrition and undernutrition. Undernutrition necessarily means, you're not getting enough of those nutrients that you need to support a healthy living. Malnutrition may mean that you're getting lots of food. You may be getting 3-4 meals a day, but what is the quality of the food that you're consuming? What is the quality of the food that you have access to? And in particularly in low and middle income countries and developing countries who import most of their food, you find that what they have access to may not be of the appropriate quality to ensure that their right to adequate food is protected, respected, and fulfilled. So necessarily, we're saying that when you're looking at the right to food, you must take a broad interpretation. Think about it as widely as you can. When you think about the right to food, what comes to mind? Those things like, I should have access to a meal, children should not be hungry. Depending on my age or stage, I should have access to food. Depending on where I live, in certain countries, I should have access to food. I was having a conversation with a friend recently who disclosed that in doing research within Indian slums, you find that within those communities, they may not have access to the most nutritious food, and necessarily they also have a right to say to the government, hey, you are not comprehensively protecting my right to adequate food. And that is the basis of food and nutrition advocacy. And that is the basis of a rights-based approach to food and nutrition advocacy. You're not just saying that people should have good food, people should have nutritious food. You're saying that people have a right, and governments in turn have a legal responsibility to ensure that they have access to good and nutritious food. Now, within the Caribbean, we've had some great examples of food and nutrition advocacy. And I'm sure if you can cast your mind, you may be able to think of some examples within your community, how rights-based advocacy can be done. What are some examples of rights-based advocacy? And if you look at this photo, this was during the pandemic, and you can see there are some members of the Barbados Defense Force, and the other individuals in the red shirts are part of the Barbados Childhood Obesity Prevention Coalition. And what that group or body is, it's a group of civil society organizations who are working towards lobbying for the prevention of childhood obesity. And within their advocacy, not only are they saying, our children need to be healthy, we want our children to be healthy, it's the right thing to do. No, they've taken the approach to put out there, children have the right to food. Children have the right to have access to nutritious food. And so that creates a stronger basis for your advocacy. You're not leaning on the moral responsibility of governments, but you're necessarily leaning on their legal responsibility. And you understand that that is a stronger commitment because necessarily there are legal implications for not fulfilling and ensuring access to certain rights. Now, the Barbados School Nutrition Policy, just to put that in a capsule, it's the call to action from civil society organizations, the Childhood Obesity Prevention Coalition, the Healthy Caribbean Coalition, where we're saying that within our schools, these are the basic things that children should have access to because it's their right. They should have access to water. They should have access to nutritious food. They should not only be afforded chips and fries and fried food within their schools, but they should have access to healthy options. Now, the basis of that approach is particularly interesting, and I'll divert a bit. When you think about persons making healthier choices, and especially in this food and nutrition space, you can't make a healthy choice in terms of what you consume unless it's available. So if you live in a country, if you live in a community where the only food that's dumped or placed within your community are energy dense or nutrition dense foods, then you can't make a healthy choice. And so in order to make that healthy choice, there needs to be the healthy option. Some governments in the Caribbean and some governments across the world have put in place a basic basket of goods. And what does that mean? That basket of goods are foods that every person should have access to. And so they may be tax-free, they may be at a cheaper rate because governments believe that everyone should have access to them. And while that may be part of them fulfilling their responsibility to protect the right to food, as advocates, we must ensure that that basket of goods includes nutritious foods, Front of package warning label. Now, children have the right to be free from predatory marketing. And I want you to think about how we connect the right or the rights of the child to the type of advocacy or the advocacy program that was put in place. So children have the right to be free from predatory marketing. Children also have the right to know what foods they are consuming. Parents have the right to know what foods they're consuming. People on the whole have the right to know what's in the food they're consuming. And so the front of package warning label system is basically saying when you go into the supermarket, you should be able to see very clearly that this food is high in fat, this food is high in sugar, this food is high in salt. So because you have that right to information, because you have that right to know what you're consuming, this type of advocacy leans on that right and says to governments, hey, you have a legal responsibility. You have a legal commitment to ensure that I'm aware of what I'm putting into my body. And so front of package warning labeling advocacy leans and depends on that human rights-based approach for the promotion of the implementation of the warning label system. There have been some successful examples in Chile, for example, where they have, I think it's the triangular system, but depending on whatever system you have, is basically saying, I need to know what I'm consuming. And so you as the government should ensure that when companies are importing their foods or exporting their foods into our country, they should have a label on it so that I know what I'm consuming because it is my right. Now, marketing in schools is something that has gone haywire, and I'm happy to see that across the world, there's been a concerted approach to ensuring that we try to weed out this predatory marketing. When children go to school, it's because they have a right to education. And that right to education should be free from any disruptions. Children also have a right to be free from predatory marketing. And so marketing in schools and the advocacy around marketing in schools, again, leans on that right or those rights of children to, one, be free from predatory marketing, and two, to have the right to a free and safe education so that you can say to governments, certain corporations should not be able to advertise to our children within schools. They should not be able to advertise these unhealthy foods to our children. And again, that has taken a human rights-based approach to advocacy. Now, lastly, the Healthy Caribbean Coalition is in the process, and it's just about ready, of publishing a rights-based childhood obesity prevention agenda. Now, I'd be happy to share with you all a copy of this once it's published, because what this agenda does is looks at different instruments of human rights. So the Convention on the Rights of a Child, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the rights of persons with disabilities, and the agenda necessarily goes through each of those conventions and pulls out from it how we can see or how we can depend on those conventions to say that children should have a right to nutritious food. Or we can say to governments, based on this convention that you have signed on to, you have a responsibility to ensure children are protected in their childhood, that children have a healthy childhood, that they have a safe childhood, and so their upbringing can be of a certain quality. So all of these necessarily go through looking within the human rights conventions, seeing what rights are connected to the type of advocacy that you want to implement, and then integrating that rights-based approach to your advocacy. So again, you're no longer saying, we would like you to do this because it's the right thing to do, or we would like you to do this because it's the moral thing to do. You have to do this because it's your legal responsibility. And I hope you can understand the stronger emphasis when you're taking a rights-based approach and necessarily a legal approach to advocacy. As a law student, soon to be attorney, I am particularly happy and would love to see more of this legal enforcement of human rights. And that is what rights-based advocacy is about. And that is what we should implement in our food and nutrition advocacy. Now, what can you do? What is the role of civil society organizations, advocates, individuals? What is your responsibility in ensuring that persons have access to the right to food, or persons have access to their right to nutrition? And whilst the government has a legal responsibility, as citizens, as civil society organizations, we have somewhat of a moral responsibility. It's good citizenship to advocate for the protection of the rights of persons to food and nutrition. So just thinking about that as well, you can see governments have a legal responsibility. Civil society organizations may not have a legal responsibility, but they have a moral responsibility to ensure the protection of the rights to persons to various things, but specifically for our purposes, the right to food and the right to nutrition. So there must be a whole of society approach to the advocacy. Now, civil society organizations within the food and nutrition advocacy space, what you can do is raise awareness about the value of human rights. Many governments, many persons do not understand the importance of human rights. Many persons do not understand the value of human rights. And when you think about the fact that human rights is something that everyone should have access to, everyone must have access to. You don't have to have a certain financial standing. You don't have to be living in a certain area. Just because you're a human being, just because you're a human person, you have access to rights. Even more so, animals have rights. So how much more do you as a person have a right to certain things? Now, beyond raising the awareness on human rights and the value of human rights, I want you to implement a rights-based approach to food and nutrition advocacy. And again, it means that you look within the conventions for the right to food, for the right to nutrition, and frame your advocacy around that rights-based approach. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at the Convention on the Rights of a Child if you're doing rights-based advocacy. You see that children have the right to a safe upbringing. Children have the right to a healthy childhood. And what you then do is tailor your advocacy to it. So if you're saying that you want children to have, or children not to have access to sugar-sweetened beverages, what you then can do is say, well, you know what? Children have the right to a healthy childhood. Children have the right to nutrition. Governments have a responsibility to ensure children have access to these rights. And therefore, what governments should do is prevent the marketing of sugar-sweetened beverages to children. So you see that connection from rights to advocacy to the call to action. Now, in terms of your advocacy to governments, necessarily you should be asking your government to create the legal and policy environment for the protection of human rights. Now, if you understand the concept of a government, as citizens, we relinquish the responsibility of running the state to the government. So we say, we're going to put our trust in these 30 persons to run the country on our behalf. We're putting our trust in you to ensure that we have access to certain things. We're putting our trust in you to ensure that you manage the country's resources well. So you're saying to governments, you owe us, you owe us this right. You owe us this access to these things. And again, you're not begging. You're not going cup in hand to ask for these things. You're saying, governments, you have a responsibility. We have a right. And we're saying that it's time that you put measures in place to ensure that we have access to food, adequate food, and we have access to nutritious food. Beyond that, both civil society organizations and the governments should be engaging the most vulnerable communities. Now, we're talking about persons who may not have access to, may not have certain financial means. We're talking about persons who may be in communities or areas that may not have access to certain foods. And so we're telling governments, or we're asking governments, in developing your policies, in developing your laws, we want you to engage with those persons who are most vulnerable. And again, that is the basis of human rights, to ensure that even the most vulnerable persons, you may not have money, you may not have access to a politician, you may not have access to someone who can give you certain things, but you have a right. You have human rights. So at the basic level, the last thing you can hold on to is your human rights. So then you must always ensure that you advocate and you say to governments, this is the only thing I have. When everything else is stripped away, I have basic human rights. And so we are asking, we're imploring that as governments, you ensure you fulfill your responsibility to protect and ensure our access to these human rights. So when you think about it in that space, and I'll take some questions in a bit, human rights creates a level playing field for everyone, whether you're in government, whether you own a business, whether you don't own a business, human rights says that we all should have access to these things. And I want you to think about tailoring your approach to rights-based advocacy based on where you are. And I'll tell you what that means. In the Caribbean, we have a specific challenge or concern around a specific period in the year. And I like to say, and I've been saying it recently, there's a certain level of anxiety across the Caribbean region during the hurricane season because we're apprehensive of what may happen. So what that means is our advocacy about the right to food and the right to nutritious food must also include advocacy on climate change and the right to the environment. Just in 2017, when Dominica was hit by a major hurricane, it wiped out their agricultural produce. And so their access to nutritious food was compromised. And so within our advocacy in the Caribbean, we also have to include and we also have to ensure that we account for those vulnerabilities, those specific vulnerabilities that we experience in the Caribbean. It may be different for you, whether you're in sub-Saharan Africa, whether you're in Europe. There may be different things that you need to take into consideration when you're advocating. It may not be that you don't have access to food or that persons within your community don't have access to food. It may mean that they don't have access to nutritious food. And so your advocacy should be framed around persons have the right to food and that food should be nutritious. And therefore this government should ensure that persons have the right and have access to nutritious foods. So it's also important to tailor your approach to the specific vulnerabilities that you may be experiencing within your country, within your community, within the space that you identify, because your challenges will be different. And again, that is why there's an importance to engage the most vulnerable communities. So that's a short snapshot of what rights-based advocacy could look like. That's a short snapshot on what food and nutrition advocacy can look like. And necessarily, I'm imploring you as individuals, civil society organizations, or even members of governments to ensure that you do your most, do your best to ensure and promote the protection and fulfillment of the right to food, and beyond the right to food, the right to nutrition. And so that is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions from you. This is supposed to be an engaging session. So, share your thoughts, share things that have passed through your mind, things you've been thinking about throughout the presentation, and we can have a discussion about it. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I think I hand over to you, Webster.
It was really informative, and I would really want to emphasize on the point that you mentioned about state obligations. Like our governments really are mandated to take into cognizance the right to food because it's enshrined in the Constitution. They've ratified it under international law. So it's really something that really needs to be looked into. And also maybe as a point of interest, if the participants, maybe after this call, could look in the case of state versus Roman Austriakov. It's an Italian case where an individual stores some food items in a supermarket, exonerated him of all those crimes. Because the court said it was. So those are some of the things that we really flow to any questions, if there are any questions amongst the panelists. But I shall most definitely start with Emily from the Philippines. I think she highlighted earlier that she has a comment and a question, something to add. So I'll give this time to Emily, to share her thoughts. And also, please remember, earlier on this year, with CSN virtual assembly, where most of us attended, and at the end of the call, we had our 5 key advocacy points, and the right to food is number 1 on that list. So that's why this webinar is really important, and it's very important for us to share our thoughts, and what we understand from the right to food. So now I shall give the floor to Emily.
Yeah. Hi, good evening to everyone. I'm Emily Oro from the Philippines International Institute of Rural Reconstruction and a member of SAN CSAPH. And Pierre, I really can relate very much to the presentations, and I appreciate the information that you have provided, as well as the experiences that you have shared. And I think here in the Philippines, and I think you've mentioned about the need to engage the government. And one of the things that we have been working on as civil society alliances is really generate some evidence as well as knowledge through research, because I think it's through evidence advocacy that we can really engage the government, because sometimes they would say, how would you say that this is happening? Do you have the data? Do you have the information? And for example, in the schools in the Philippines, I think one of the things that you have mentioned is about the right of the children. They can only eat what they have access on. And this is where the importance of the school food environment comes in. So currently we're doing some research on school food environment to serve as basis for identifying gaps and development of policies around school environment. So I'd like you to share a bit more about how else can we generate some evidence, or how else can we engage the policymakers, for example.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily. And I'm really happy to hear about the specific approach in looking at children's rights. And that's one of my passion areas. So within the Caribbean, when we started our childhood obesity prevention advocacy, when we started our school nutrition advocacy, it was important to get the data, to get the research. So one of the organizations that worked tirelessly in pulling together that data was the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. And so what we did is we had children. We had students within secondary schools. Of course, you asked for permission. And we had them rate on a scorecard what do they think about the food that they have access to? Would they like to have access to more nutritious food? Do they have access to water? And so the children themselves were able to inform us anonymously what is happening within their school environments and what they would like to have access to. Beyond that, beyond getting the information from the students themselves, it was important to engage parents. It was important to engage the major stakeholders. So one of the groups that we had to engage in a part of the fight were the vendors. And so governments may be able to control what's happening within the schools, but you also need to have a conversation with those persons who may be selling outside of the schools, because children may leave the school environment and go outside of the school and purchase what is available there. And so we also had to paint a picture for the government that not only should you be looking at what's happening within the schools, but what's happening outside of the schools. The civil society organizations, it is important that for your civil society organization partners to understand that they have a watchdog role. And so what they should be doing is when they see examples of funny things happening within schools or happening within the country, take a picture of it or take a screenshot of it. If you see there is an advertising or a company that's advertising fried chicken and chips within the school, take a picture of that advertisement. You know, if there's within the school a big poster for sugar sweetened beverages, take a picture of that. And when you compile that information, you're able to say to your governments, well, hey, look at what is happening within our schools, you know? And the importance of rights-based advocacy and the value of it is that you're saying, you start by saying, you know, children have the right to nutritious foods. Children have the right to just go to school and be children. They shouldn't have to battle with advertising. And, you know, governments, That's not happening within our schools. That's not what's going on within our community. And that is where the evidence that you've collected is important, so you can show to the government, well, hey, the children themselves have said they would like to have access to healthier foods. We have evidence of this marketing happening within the schools. We also have evidence of parents saying that they would like to see governments implement legal policy or just policies around protecting the rights of children to food. And governments want to, politicians want to win the government, politicians want to win elections. And so when you say children, parents, corporations, civil society organizations are asking for these things, beyond being citizens, you're speaking in the language that they understand, huh? These are voters, right? So we're saying that if you don't fulfill this legal responsibility, we'll have to take a second thought on whether you are the right group, the right party to be in charge of this country, or whether you have the best interests of the children, citizens of this country at heart, and whether you are committed to protecting their rights. So it's important that your civil society organizations, your partners, understand their watchdog role to document when they see certain strange things happening, yeah? Sorry, is there... Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Pierre. So the other questions coming through, so I think I can just chuck two questions to you. The first one is like, how can young people be more involved? And then the second one is, what are the challenges of using rights-based approach to advocacy, and how best can we overcome those challenges, or challenge if there's one?
Yeah, so in terms of the role of young persons, there should be nothing for young people without young people. I'm sure you've heard this saying, there should be nothing for us without us. And so young persons necessarily have to be a part of the advocacy efforts. In Barbados, one of the things that was specifically poignant around the advocacy about the right to nutritious foods was that the students led a march throughout the city saying to the government, we need access to nutritious foods, or you need to put these things in place. So young persons, youth advocates have a specific role in raising awareness and lobbying their governments. And young people have a unique role because we're saying to governments, we are experiencing this. We are the ones within the schools, and we are the ones asking for this. And in relation to the challenges with rights-based advocacy, one of the things that you may find is that not all governments pay due respect to human rights. Not all governments care about respecting human rights. And so in raising awareness as civil society organizations, and in raising awareness amongst the citizens, amongst your community, that, hey, these guys have a legal responsibility. You're putting the pressure on governments to necessarily understand that we know that you have a legal responsibility. You can't hide from it. So as much as you may want to shy away from your responsibility, we're saying to you, you have a legal responsibility and we're demanding that you protect it. So one of the challenges may be that you may have a government who may not pay specific attention to it. Another thing is human rights-based advocacy takes time. It takes time. Our successes in the Caribbean weren't won over 6 months or a year. It took time to educate citizens about the rights. It took time to get the buy-in of stakeholders, to get the buy-in of parents. And then it took time for that message to build to the extent that governments had no choice but to pay attention to the calls from citizens and civil society organizations. So it takes time. So you as an advocate, you as a civil society organization must be committed to putting in the work over time to build that research, to build that awareness, and then to continue that advocacy for the protection of human rights. Yeah?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Pierre. I don't know if there are any more questions among us, the participants, but this really has been an enlightening session that we have had today to get to know the nexus between, food rights and the right to nutrition, and just be able to demarcate that just providing food does not necessarily, speak to adequate nutrition. So it seems like there are more questions coming through. Let me read this one. Yes, this talks about, it says, in your experience, what were the main challenges in using a rights-based approach in advocating for better nutrition? And is there like any advice for overcoming them? Of which I feel like you've just touched on that right now.
Yeah. I just did. I want to look at Christopher Twist's question in terms of the success stories.
Yes.
And how they were won, and whether they required legal action. So it's interesting. We have not yet in the Caribbean, and I say yet because if we have to, we will. We have not yet had to take legal action against the government to ensure they protect these rights to food, right to nutrition, right to health. The pressure has been enough. The pressure of saying and raising awareness and people getting anxious and agitated and, what is the government doing has been enough. So we've not yet had to engage legal action. But if you must take an example of how legal action can be useful or impactful, just look at the climate change advocacy. There have been many examples of young persons, children in Australia and the US, who've taken their governments to court to say, you need to protect our rights to the environment. And necessarily it's put pressure on governments to try to put certain things in place. So in the same way, with this rights-based advocacy to food and nutrition, the hope is when you put that advocacy effort out there, when you engage in this rights-based advocacy, governments will feel the pressure. So what you're doing is putting pressure on them. You're necessarily telling them, we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop marching. We're not going to stop putting information out there. We're not going to stop sending you letters. We're not going to stop hosting meetings to inform people that you're not adequately protecting their human rights. So that has been enough to persuade governments in the Caribbean, but there's still more to be done, and there's still a longer way to go. And again, you sometimes have to speak in the language that they understand. Dollars and votes, if you don't protect this right, we don't think we'll be voting you back in. If you don't protect this right, I don't know that we can fund or support certain programs. And so in order for persons to come to that position, they must understand intimately the value of human rights. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? And I'll be happy if you just have a statement, if you just want to share something or share your thoughts, I think that's fine as well.
Yes, I do think we have another question, but it's in French, I think. So maybe if one of the hosts could help with the translation.
So luckily, I do know some French. So yes. It's basically how do you test nutrition's value of foods without lab testing? It's a great question. And what some countries have is they have their trade policies. Their trade policies necessarily say when you're importing foods into our country, on the packaging, on the labeling, you must indicate what the nutrition content or what is inside of these foods. So even on the back of your cans or drinks, you'll see 10 grams of sugar, 40 grams of sugar, 10 grams of sodium. And so that information on the labeling is enough to indicate the value of the food in terms of what nutrients is high in. And I know some persons may be wondering, well, can't they just put anything on the packaging? There's a legal duty of these corporations to put accurate labeling on the packaging. And that's part of the front of package labeling system. We are saying to corporations that you're not allowed to say that, this juice is the healthiest product, or this cereal will make you big and strong when it has 40 grams of sugar, because that's false advertising. And so part of the advocacy is saying to governments that they must ensure that persons who are importing into the country engage in honest marketing. And so the front of package warning label system, there's some countries that use a stoplight system. So if let's say there's 10 grams of sodium within the food, they'll be at green. If there's 20 grams, they'll be at orange. If they're at 50 grams, they'll be at red. So you can see based on the quantity as it goes up, the level of warning for the food packaging increases as well. So that's a way for you to be able to show to governments or to identify what the quality of the food that is available is like. Okay, I see some more French questions. Okay, so from Sean, yeah, so it is a challenge in terms of, telling governments or trying to rely on the conscience of governments to implement these rights. But again, what you're doing with your human rights advocacy is you're not saying to governments, we would like you to do it because we want you to understand it's the moral thing to do, or we want you to understand it's the right thing to do. It's the legal thing to do. It's your legal responsibility. And I do think, and you are right, Sean, in pointing out that governments across the world may not take human rights seriously, because I don't think many persons understand what human rights are and what the value of human rights are. And so this is why our advocacy is important. This is why a civil society organization, we must raise awareness so that both citizens and governments can understand what their duty is in terms of protecting their rights, and citizens can understand what rights they have access to. And again, you've pointed out the governments must pay attention to, the right to water, the right to hygiene. And again, rights are interdependent. So when you ensure, or when you're trying to ensure someone has the right to food, they must have access to water. They must ensure the right to water. They must have access to healthcare. So the human rights system is interconnected. You can't protect one right and neglect the other. You must necessarily try to incorporate all of them collectively in your approach. And then there's a question from Jules. Okay, so I think that's the same question that Sean put in. Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Just conscious of time. Questions, comments, queries, concerns, venting.
Sure, I think Pierre, now we can wrap up, and I'm really glad that we had this webinar. Yeah, and we had this sharing session whereby we were able to share our experience and also your views from a very legal perspective. Well, I also picked up some points I'm going to use in my dissertation, so I also benefited as well. Yeah, so I'm really happy that we had, this webinar, and I'm really glad that things turned out well for us. Yeah, so I think if there, even from the members of the CSN, if there are any questions or any links or documents that you'd want, you can mostly engage with Sean, and I'm pretty sure he'll be able, you'll be able to provide you with such. And we, as part of the civil society, movement, as Pierre rightly said, we are the watchdogs. We need to be on the lookout for any of those things that we need to lobby for or lobby against. And that way, we can make sure that the right food, which most, if not all states, have an obligation to uphold, will most definitely be upheld. And yes, things will most definitely turn out well for us using the legal frameworks that are available to us. Yes, so I think that's it for today. And let's remain in touch. Let's remain a community that speaks to the right of food, and trying as much as we can to research and find out how how best can we engage in the space moving forward. Yeah. So maybe just a few notes maybe for staff to read. You might check out the guidelines, the FAO guidelines on the right to food, and also you can read articles by Professor Amartya Sen. We took in his series titled "The Politics of Hunger." I think in that book he rightly puts across well, the interrelation between the legal domain and the right to food, and how best you can use legal frameworks to push for the right food agenda and making sure that everyone has equitable and adequate food and a diet. Yeah. So I think that's a wrap from me. Thank you so much for joining today, and I hope we all got something and we learned something. And to Pierre, the great guest speaker, thank you so much for showing up today. It was really a lovely comment.
Thank you.
Yes, I hope I got to be a lawyer like you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, sure. So I think that marks the end of our. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Thank you, Webster.
Thank you for joining.